Hello, this is David Murdoch. I'm here with my colleague Rhonda Hodo, and we are about to show a presentation that was first presented at the Astro conference this year. And we figured it would be something good to show our clients and people interested in proactive recruiting. So my name is David Murdoch, as I said, and I'm the Managing Director of Novia's Staffing and Productivity Practice. I've been with Novia about 5 years now and have been healthcare consulting since 1993. The last 15 years have been focused mostly on staffing and productivity. And Rhonda, please introduce yourself.
I'm Rhonda Hodo, consultant with Novia Strategy with labor and staffing. I have been with Novia for a total of 3 years as well.
Great.
Sorry.
Thanks, Rhonda.
Did anybody see the screen? Oh, okay, there we go.
So the agenda today, we wanted to review what the objectives of the session were. This project that we're going to talk about today and the work that we're describing is a result of a recent project that we had with clients as a result of some of the RN staffing challenges. Related to that, there is a challenge around recruiting, and then we're going to talk a little bit about why our productivity team got involved in this project, what some of the barriers experienced when you implement a proactive recruiting model, review a little bit of lessons learned, and then have an epilogue after the presentation at Ashra. What we wanted to do is really describe and discuss how predictive analytics can help the recruiting process. We're hearing a lot about big data now, especially its use in healthcare and using that data to predict outcomes. And we thought that using that same mindset of predictive analytics with regards to recruiting and staffing needs would be a good area to explore. And we'll talk a little bit about the process of that today. We want to identify what the critical data elements are in their proactive recruiting model, and as organizations begin down this path, what are some of the things that they need to consider related to the data requirements. And ultimately, we want to equip the listeners with what they would need to really begin making the case for using predictive analytics within your organization's recruiting efforts. The staffing challenges at a recent client are really displayed here in these two graphs, and these are graphs from a couple of different projects. The top graph shows that, like many organizations that we are experienced with, the turnover related to the younger tenured staff is significant. And as you can see here, it was mostly high in the less than 3 years. So right around the time where nurses were coming up to speed and really being able to be very productive and very skilled and qualified, they're leaving the organization. And the bottom chart shows that for the client that we began developing the recruiting model, proactive recruiting model for, they really had an issue with turnover and turnover in each of their sites, and we're showing 3 of their facilities here. Turnover was higher than what was expected for the industry. And, Rhonda was on this project as well. So Rhonda, please talk a little bit about what some of the outcomes and what are some of the challenges that are caused when employee turnover is high.
So when employee turnover is high, as David mentioned, usually that is a significant cost to the organization because it takes on costs of training, hiring, recruiting, hiring, and training that new staff that comes on. So there is a significant cost. So anytime that you can retain your employees brings down the cost of hiring, recruiting, and training those employees even more.
Great. Thanks, Rhonda. And I thought this quote was quite germane. It's not a healthcare quote, but it's a quote from an IT organization's CEO but they had a 97 retention rate. So regardless of the industry, that retention rate is stellar. And so what he mentioned and talked about was the fact that the retention is a process that really starts at the application process through to onboarding. And so how that applies to what we're discussing here today is, in as much as you can spend more time with the recruiting and application process and that screening process for that right fit, the better. So in proactive recruiting, you're able to actually increase the amount of time that you can have to screen applicants. The next slide shows time to fill for bedside RNs, and Rhonda did this research and identified, some interesting considerations for organizations when you think about the time to fill a position. A lot of, from an HR perspective, the thought process is it's the time to actually hire a person. But Rhonda was able to find this research that indicated that there were other considerations. So, Rhonda?
Right. So on the bar chart on the left, you can pretty much tell there that the majority of those specialty positions, it takes a higher time, an average time to fill than it normally for the regular positions, such as for your like L&D RN. So it takes about 3 more months to actually fill those positions. And after the bar chart on the left, so if you add about 6 more weeks in for, let's say, orientation time, you can tell now that the RN takes about five more months in order for that RN to get onto the unit. This affects the unit's productivity by having higher amounts of overtime to help cover those gaps, and even time in orientation is productive time charged to the unit, which when the RN is not at the bedside.
Great. So as people are considering the amount of time that they need to plan and have the amount of time they have to fill the need, they actually need to factor in the time for a nurse to be up and running and productive in terms of providing patient care on the unit. So here's another way of looking at that, and this is a process flow that shows traditional recruiting of RN positions, where it begins really with the need arising, and the need arises, once the application position becomes vacant. Flows through the position requisition process, and a number of organizations have some very complex position requisition approval processes. All that needs to occur prior to recruiting beginning, which is the third chevron from the left. And the candidate sourcing, the onboarding, orientation, and training, all those activities which are critical, as that IT CEO mentioned, the screening process and onboarding process is critical to retention. Those are the items that tend to be rushed when the need arises and the need needs to be filled quickly. Those are the areas that would tend to be rushed, and evidence shows that these are the processes that can really increase the retention for our registered nurses. The next slide is just an explosion out of the position requisition approval process, and this was from the client that we were working with for the proactive recruiting model. And I'll let Rhonda talk a little bit about the experience that we had as she built out this swim lane for the client.
As David said, when we were asking about the position requisition approval process, realized that we probably needed to map out the process, as there were several steps in the process that needed to have a visual understanding. So when we presented this swim lane to leadership, it was quite eye-opening for them, as they realized that there were several steps that were involved and the amount of people involved just to approve one requisition. So with the implementation of the proactive recruitment model, it will help reduce that process by 7 steps and also remove 3 people from that process.
Great. Thanks, Rhonda.
Mm-hmm.
And so what we found out through this process, that it really did require a disruption of standard practice in order to allow for a predictive, analytically driven recruiting process. After the proactive recruiting model is put in place, you then move from the previous process flow to one in which the need is predicted well before it arises, and we'll talk about the data required and the process changes required to incorporate this. But you'll see that once the data is predicted, you start the recruiting process, you get the onboarding process, increasing the amount of time available to get that right fit candidate, so that once the need arises and the need is filled, that really collapses that time from that the need arising to the need being filled. Now, what was interesting about presenting at ASHRA is our work is typically focused on productivity measurement and productivity improvement. That is really a lot of the work that we do in our practice is related to the productivity side. So how we came to be involved in the proactive recruiting model is once we identified some challenges, as you saw previously in the client with nurse staffing, and some of that was played out in productivity and observed through productivity, but also in just increased labor expense and identifying those typical HR metrics of turnover and what the impact would be there. We identified the need to be more proactive around recruiting. And our colleagues that will do our HR reviews identified that as a challenge. And as we were having our team meetings, we discovered that a lot of the data that would be required to produce the proactive recruiting model is the same data that we would use in a productivity project. So having the data around historical workload, your typical labor budgets, which would relate to position control. All those are related to employee skill mix, the schedules, FTE status. All those same metrics and same data is used for productivity measurement, could also be applied in using and developing a proactive recruiting model. So once we identified that as an issue in the original assessment, and this organization was a high-performing organization that they took probably 90% of the recommendations from the comprehensive assessment and had work teams identified to work on those issues and challenges and move those items forward within the organization. What they did request help with, because it was relatively new thinking within the organization, is the development and implementation of the proactive recruiting model. So this is just an excerpt from the proposal that identified, what we would be delivering for the client and what issues we would be addressing there. The next is a really graphical representation of the elements of the proactive recruiting model that we identified as critical elements. And starting from outside looking in, how do you really identify what your recruiting gaps are that would take into account the time to fill, what your candidate pipeline is, how flexible your current staff is, so how much of the recruiting need or resource need could be filled with flexible staffing, such as increasing part-time staff hours or using per diem part-time staff, flexing those hours up. And then, what is the budget of those particular departments? So moving inside then, to get to the recruiting gaps, you have to know, okay, well, what staff is expected to be here? And that would take into consideration your current position control, so who is on your current roster in each of the departments, what your training timeline is, and then what turnover is to be expected. A lot of systems that are in place now that do proactive scheduling will account for the workload and account for the people in positions currently, but looking forward, what I've seen as a gap is not considering what the turnover in each of the departments is. And Rhonda will talk a little bit more about how we define turnover for the Predictive recruiting model. So finally, at the core of the Predictive recruiting model is using that historical workload, and on nursing units it will be that census, and we use that historical census. Typically we'll like to have census every 4 hours. We'll use the staffing grids and staffing plans and the roles and titles. So those are the core elements, and so going outside in, you really have to figure out what your recruiting gaps are. To do that, you need to know what your staff resources will be at the need, and then what your staff requirements are. So as we begin the project, and Rhonda, I know you remember this early drawing that we had here about what the model would look like. It turned out it wasn't too far from this, but we actually worked this because of, some of our team had background in product management, so we were familiar with using a wireframe as a discussion point, and we actually sat down with department leadership and human resources and had the recruiters provide, input on what they would likely use this for. So, Rhonda, any thoughts on how that early meeting was in terms of getting input from the recruiters?
Well, I thought the recruiters, their input was, first of all, extremely amazing, because we needed to understand. We wanted to make this design useful for them, and I think one of the biggest things that they were talking about was that new grad to experience piece, was how because a new grad will take more time with training than an experienced person, and that will actually take more time to actually hire that person and get them on the bedside. So that was a really good experience for us to have them in the room.
Yeah, great. I'm glad you pointed it out, Rhonda, because one of the things that as we were designing it, we thought it would be really cool to be able to have an active bar there to where they could drag, the experience level as they were building the model out. It turned out that was a little bit too difficult to implement technically, so we actually just let them put a number in there, which works just as well. So.
Right.
Then, some of the typical data gaps that we have, and Rhonda, since you did a lot of the data work with this client and really understood their data, I'll let you spend some time on this slide, or ask you to spend some time on this slide.
Thanks, David. So as David said, as we were going through this process, there are data requirements that the PRM needed and possible gaps that organizations may have with visibility to this data. So the PRM needs granular historical workload. And as David mentioned, we prefer to have census data points at every 4 hours. We also need operational staffing grids. So not just grids that are based on budget or only cover high volume census points, but grids that cover all workload or census points. Standardized roles and job titles. Job code mapping for all direct care positions. So if you have an RN1, RN2, RN3, etc., they all need to be mapped to the direct RN, CNAs to CNAs, and etc. Up-to-date position rosters. We've come to realize that many organizations, the rosters are maintained on the unit or department level, but having a centrally maintained roster for the organization is highly preferred and needed for the PRM data. Data to calculate FTE turnover. Not just what your typical FTE turnover rate, which I'll discuss a little bit in a couple more slides, but what I would consider to be complete FTE activity. So FTE leakage, meaning from full-time to part-time, transfers within the department to other positions, or transfers to another department would be considered that FTE turnover rate. Budget by skill mix is highly preferred. So typically the budget process stops at the unit or department level, but it'd be great to have the skill mix budgeted. So for RNs, a skill mix, CNAs, a skill mix, and so forth, as a budgeted, and so forth and so on. And then also with visibility for recruiting data. So the pipeline and time to fill data will also need visibility into that. And we've noticed that some people, they have another system, like a web-based third-party system, which will require a download into that PRM system. Next slide, David, please. Here. So also when reviewing the process requirements for the PRM, it was realized that there may be some process gaps that organizations may have in order to fulfill the data requirement. So the PRM needs position requisition flexible enough to allow for proactively releasing high-impact positions. Currently, a lot of position requisition processes justify what the need is now. The proactive recruitment model looks ahead 1 year, 6 months, 3 months, etc. And it's pretty good to have that process in place that just allows for the quick release of those proactive recruiting, for those to proactively recruit. Onboarding and training expectations standardized and consistent. Having standards in place for training is highly needed, as the model takes training time into consideration. Consistent and timely inventory of available positions. Visibility into available positions, such as the candidates that are already in the pipeline, those that are onboarding, are those positions that have been filled and have yet not came into the organization yet. Float and flexible staffing policies documented and adhered to. So how does your organization deal with short-term spikes? Will agency suffice for that short-term time? Do you all use overtime to take over that short-term spikes, or any of your flexible positions available, like your PRN or part-time positions? David, want to talk anything more about the process map?
No, I think that was good. I think that the key there was to really understand from the client's perspective, what are some of those significantly political processes that you need to really get more stakeholder input in order to change. So, for instance, being able to release a position based on a prediction versus having a vacant position. That might be something that some organizations need to ease into, and that actually was some discussion that came up during the ASHRA conference. So just thinking through what not only some of those data gaps would be, but more importantly, or equally as important, what some of those process gaps, and then, what are some of those highly political or entrenched processes that you'll need to change in order to make the most effective use of the proactive model.
Okay. So the FTE turnover calculation, I believe David and we went back and forth about what the traditional turnover activity calculation was and what we needed for the PRM data model to actually capture all of what we would consider FTE turnover activity within a department. So in the traditional calculation of turnover does not take in consideration as what we call it FTE leakage, which is that full-time to part-time, any transfers. They just pretty much calculate just separations from their organization. So the PRM needs to take into consideration not only the FTE leakage and transfers, but any type of activity that is in that happens on that unit. So in this model, we have 2 terminations, 1 replacement hire, 1 full-time to part-time, 1 full-time to per diem, 2 transfers, 1 per diem to full-time. In the traditional model, it takes into consideration the 2 terminations and then the 1 full-time to per diem, because those are less FTEs on that unit. So in that calculation, it would be 3 separated employees from that unit, and you divide that by the beginning, adding the beginning employees and the ending employees and dividing that by 2.
to get your turnover rate. So this unit started off with 70 employees, but with all the turnover activity, it was 66.5 employees that they ended up with. So using that calculation, it comes up to be 4.4% of turnover calculation. Now looking at that same activity with a different turnover, looking at the turnover calculation using the full-time equivalent, you will use the beginning position control, which is why that position control roster is highly important for using our calculation for turnover. So look at what the beginning position control FTEs were, subtracting the ending position control FTEs, and dividing by the beginning position control FTEs. So here you'll take 70 minus that 66.5 FTEs and divide by 70 FTEs. This formula takes in consideration those terminations, the full-time to part-time people, the transfers out of the unit, and that per diem to full-time staff. So as you can tell here in this calculation, there's 5% turnover rate. So that's about a 0.6% difference in turnover calculation. David,
and what's key? Yeah, I think what's key here is that you will still need to have your traditional turnover calculation. So we're not suggesting, changing that traditional calculation for benchmarking that you're doing, for internal tracking, for internal comparisons. But in order for the model to work most effectively, having it calculate the way we have it calculated here is what we put forward to our clients. And I'll just call out one thing that you said, Rhonda, that you underscored as you were talking about the new turnover calculation for the predictive recruiting model, is that level of importance of that position control, of up-to-date position control. We'll return there later. Actually, we'll go there now. So one of the things that we found out, and it never ceases to amaze me, the fact that the position control or employee rosters or whatever you call it, that listing of active employees and what their FTE status is, how fluid that is from organization to organization. And we do labor productivity work in hundreds of hospitals over the last few years. And whenever you talk about, where's the position control, is it something that's held in HR? Is it at the unit level? Is it some mix between? It really is shocking that there are, highly performing organizations that don't really have a good handle on the position control. So this particular client did not have position control that you could go push a button or print it out in one centralized location. So that was identified as a gap early in the process, and as a result of us needing the calculation of FTE turnover for the predictive recruiting model, we actually created a tool for them that produces the position listing for them on a biweekly basis, but also produces the turnover calculation for the model. So they actually had a staff member that was spending 2 to 3 days to produce. It was about a day for the larger facility and about another day and a half for the other 2 facilities to produce that position control. And now she's able to, with downloading 2 files and using the tool that we created, to produce those in a matter of moments. So they were actually very happy to have that tool. We needed it for the predictive recruiting model to work, for the FTE turnover calculation. So it was really the best of both worlds for both us in producing the data, but also making them more efficient in producing that position control. The completed model. So here is a screenshot of the completed model, and as you see, it's not extremely far off from the original wireframe. The top right-hand section, the bar graphs, are the FTEs that are expected to be available and then the FTEs for anticipated need. And that is all driven from the data that you see here. So going from on the left-hand side, working down the chart, you're able to run the proactive recruiting model for all of the positions that are on the staffing grids for the nursing unit. So there's a registered nurse version, CNA version, unit clerk version, charge nurse version. Of course, charge nurses don't really flex that much, but you can run it. And it allows you to do that for each of the departments that are, each of the nursing units for all 3 sites. And the green, we've redacted the names here, so that would be hospital and unit, and then the position is registered nurse. It pulled from that position control table that was created from the position control tool, saying that there were 23 FTEs that were currently in that position control. The filled and open positions is at 25.7. They're recruiting 1, and all of the additional information, the freeze model button is, since this is based on a predictive analytical model, you're able to put in overrides for the turnover. If you look to the right, because all of this is based on the census that is expected to occur on the unit, which is the lower right-hand line chart. So that's the census in patient days expected. That drives the staffing need. The actual staffing or expected staffing is impacted by your expected FTE turnover. And one of the things that was added as a result of working through this with the recruiters and with the department leaders there was they had the ability to have historical turnover, but if you have a certain number of retirements coming up, you can actually plug that in the model and override the historical data. So you're able to do that. Other considerations that are driving the model: once you have that expected FTE turnover, you got the float and overtime percentage. So what percentage of your need are you anticipating being able to fill with your current staff with working more hours? So that's able to be set for each of the units. And what's great about what's one of the things that is a benefit of the model is it really does partner your recruiters with your nursing leaders to have those conversations in terms of, well, what retirements do you have coming up? Or are you anticipating in July to have higher levels of overtime and float because we see that your need is going to be lower in February, so do we really need to ramp up in January? So those are the kinds of conversations that this tool really facilitates between your recruiters and your nursing leaders. Ron, any additional comments on some of the lessons learned through the implementation of the recruiting model?
No, David, I think you covered it well.
Okay. So the recruiting model, so this is the model. One of the things that you're able to do that Ashley didn't cover is, adjusting the the orientation time for each of the units, so you can have a different orientation time, because critical care units typically will require more increased orientation time than more intense orientation time than your med-surg units. The time to fill, from an HR recruiting perspective, are you having to spend more time recruiting, OB? Does it take longer to fill OB positions? So that's all customizable, to each of the units. So some of the lessons that we learned throughout this process, the fact that even, successful, thriving organizations can be missing some of the core elements. In this example, it was not having that position requisition process. They were actually a little bit more open to the recruiting based on prediction versus the open position being opened. The fact that success and implementation of this model does require really focused project management and coordination of various stakeholders, being able to pull in the recruiters when we needed to pull in the recruiters, being able to engage IT at the right time, and having the model set up on the servers. So really there's a lot of moving parts, and so having that focused project management and coordination was critical to be able to get the project up and running and moving along. Another thing about the recruiters, the fact that because we were called in because of some challenges with RN recruiting, there were times where they were extremely busy, and so we had to be very judicious with the use of their time, have meetings, very short, focused meetings to get input, and then send them on their way to continue recruiting. Rhonda, talk a little bit about what we learned or how our interaction with both the decision support resources and the technical HR people were critical to the project.
They were very critical. The decision support people pretty much were able to give us all the data requirements that we needed, and were such a great help to us, just because not only were they able to get the data to us, but able to understand the wording that we needed to get the data on a continual basis. So it can be automatically populated into the PRM to get it onto their servers, on their network. They knew where everything was, and to basically help out with any possible bottlenecks in getting us that information. And also we needed that operational HR person who was also understood the data pieces, because they knew what they needed, and we knew what we were trying to create. So getting both of those heads to talk at the same time and to hear out what the organization data that they had and what the HR needed was very integral in trying to create the PRM to mirror what the organization needed.
And just a couple more lessons. The fact that it's heavily mathematical with formulas. One of the challenges was the level of frequency that we got the census data. While we prefer it every 4 hours, they were able to get it to us every 6 hours. And so, and as we were implementing the model, some of the configuration of it was set up that we were expecting it every 4 hours. So that came out in us looking at some of the sample data and realizing that, we need to change some of the calculations to be based on every 6 hours. So just being able to check and recheck the math was a lesson learned there. Updating the timeline, this project was extended, quite significantly because of some of the data availability gaps. So just being able to update the timeline accordingly and make sure that all the stakeholders were aware of what the challenges were, and then we as a team, worked to fill those gaps. The fact that they had assigned that individual in HR to produce the position control documents, and when I heard the amount of time that she needed to actually produce them, that's when we decided that we would make the tool, make a specialized tool that wasn't really an original scope, but we were able to do it to fill a data need, but also streamline some of the processes there. And really treating the tool as you would a commercial product with product management considerations. This is going to be in release 1. And designing the system such that it's something that can grow and account for other departments, but really focusing where we needed to deliver the product specific to nursing, but having it flexible for future growth. And the quote that we have here is from the recruiting manager. She did say that, this process, this tool will have significant impact in the coming months. And I am not able to advance the slide, so stop or pause. Did we pause?
You can keep going, David.
Okay, keep going. Okay, all right. So since we did present this at ASTRA, I wanted to include some of the questions that came up towards the end of the presentation. It was very good dialogue, and I was seeing people, some of them process this new concept. Some people had implemented some form or fashion of it. But one of the questions and a good bit of conversation was about releasing positions based on the predicted need. So there was some concern at some of the sites that the organization, the leadership of the organization would not be comfortable with that. And so while I understand that, and while as you implement the proactive analytics, the predictive analytics, you should, first of all, get more comfortable with the fact that the needs will arise there. So there's probably some level of testing that you can do with the model to help ease that level of comfort with releasing those positions. But also it can be used in terms of filling a pipeline. So if you're not ready to go with the full predictive model, using the predictive model, you can use it not to make the hiring decision, but also to fill your pipeline. So if you see that your pipeline needs are going to be increased, in the summer months or winter months, you can plan accordingly. So it still will help you reduce that time and increase your ability to screen applicants appropriately. Ultimately, we would like the positions to be released on the predicted need, but there is a middle ground there that will still improve your process, your recruiting process. Some question around historical data, how much data is good enough. We've used 2 years worth of data for clients, not only in the proactive recruiting model, but also in some of our other staffing kind of core flexible analysis that we didn't discuss today, but we still use that. But that really depends on what your census trends have been. If your census trends have been consistently increased, then there are adjustments to the model in terms of the time frame used that you can put in place. There are also adjustments that you can make to the model based on the patterns, and the cyclical nature could be the same, but maybe your peaks are getting higher than they have in the past. So those kinds of analytical changes can be made to the model as needed. Do you factor in anticipated turnover? And this was asked around what about the impact of FMLA. Then that is something that if you do have significant levels of FMLA and need to fill your needs, the model can help you predict the need. How you fill it based on the impact of FMLA really depends on your experience with FMLA and having those flexible resources to fill those employees that are on temporary leave. So you might not want to pick up a full-time employee if they are going to be returning. But the model still helps you anticipate the need and how you fill the need. It might not be a hire, but it could be maybe an agency person to fill the temporary need. But the model will help you predict that need appropriately. Rhonda, any final thoughts in terms of what we learned, or thoughts that people that are thinking about implementing the proactive recruiting model, what they might have to think about?
The only thing I think I want to just, continue to emphasize is probably, I think like you said, it's just getting all the data points that we need, which is the position rosters, just visibility into their time to fill, any of their FTE turnover information, just some of the data points, the census data points. Just these are some of the main key points in order to have a successful implementation.
Great. Well, thanks for those of you that have listened. Thank you, and looking forward to speaking with you. If you have questions about the model, we are continuing to produce white papers, small topic papers on the topic and how we're using the data, and we'd definitely be happy to speak with you about it. Thank you very much.